Very good afternoon, and thanks for clicking on to the Tuesday edition of Vogan's European Outlook. If you're enjoying the content here on the channel, be sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We do have plenty of things going on. Very complex situation evolving now with the split in the tropospheric polar vortex. We're starting to see colder air getting driven south into the lower 48 of the United States. We've seen record warm temperatures of late across the southern tier, but we are starting to see Arctic air press once again. Minus 30s, even close to minus 40 in the Dakotas this morning. And we do have this continued west-east split over Europe. Relatively mild conditions remain over Western Europe. We are starting to see building cold into the eastern half of the continent. All the while, the Arctic oscillation appears to be going into its most negative that we've seen all winter so far. And I'm curious to wonder if the GFS ensemble proves correct with this level of negative in terms of the Arctic oscillation. I'd be curious to know when the last time we've seen this. Maybe February 2021. I could be wrong with that. There is an interesting situation developing in with this tanking of the Arctic oscillation. We're seeing the build-up of warmer air masses over the Arctic, and as a consequence of building pressure over the Arctic region, pressure into the 1050s and millibars, for example, over the pole, we're then seeing the southward push of Arctic air into the middle latitude pattern. The complexity comes when you factor in the influence that Arctic air has on the Atlantic jet stream and the consequential push of milder air towards Western Europe. All the while, that other piece of the polar vortex that is dropping south into the middle latitudes is into Europe. And therefore, we've got this major battleground, and essentially the UK and Ireland sits right underneath that battleground. And I'll try my best to explain this as best possible because it is a very complex situation. Now, when you look at the GFS ensemble, mean polar cap heights, we've got a remaining strong polar vortex up into the upper and mid levels of the stratosphere. Even the lower stratosphere remains reasonably strong, but it's essentially what we've seen is a build-up of pressure within the lower portions of the atmosphere, and that is what's helping drain that Arctic air southwards into the middle latitudes here. We've seen that essentially from the very end of January, and it looks as if it's going to peak in intensity around about mid-February. So if we look at the upper levels here of the model, you can see that we are, as high pressure builds in over the Arctic region, we're seeing, these are the 850 anomalies, by the way, so we're seeing these waves of Arctic air getting driven south over North America. And as a consequence, we're seeing a strengthening jet stream between the Caribbean and Eastern North America. As a result, the deep areas of low pressure, we're starting to see a little bit of an eastward extension of the trough exit North America and moving into the Atlantic. Now, the complex aspect about this is we've got that secondary lobe of tropospheric polar vortex dropping into Europe, but we've got this battleground, so to speak, developing here. So we've got these two pools of cold air drilling south into the middle latitudes of the northern hemisphere, but essentially we've got westerlies going to become more active, while we've got a cold pool that is trying to push south and westwards over the continent of Europe. Look at how mild the air is at 850 over the Arctic region as we see this split in the vortex developing. So what influence is this having in the stratosphere itself? This is the current situation according to the GFS. We've got the strong warming taking place. Been talking about this for some time, but I'll tell you what, that stratospheric polar vortex, by the way, has remained robust right the way through winter. It's doing a pretty decent job at fighting against any warming that's taken place out with. And if we play through this loop here, you can see this burst of warming, but essentially that warming is all towards the eastern hemisphere and then moving over the top of the pole and into the north of North America here. The coldest temperatures across the North Atlantic and across Europe remain in place here within the stratosphere. And then as we continue to play right the way through into the second half of the month, we've got this renewed burst of warming, but it's coming in off the Atlantic, which is quite interesting. And the very end of this GFS run sees a split in the vortex towards the end of February here. One piece going into Central Eurasia, the other piece going into North America. By the way, that there could signal some major cold driving into North America. While we've got a strong push of Arctic air getting driven south over the North American continent at the moment, this could be refueling this Arctic push into North America. It could be a very, very dramatic end to winter on the North American side of the pole. Very, very interested to see how this evolves for Europe in terms of this very strong warming within the 10 millibar level. But you can see this very distinct split, and the modelling has been alluding to this for some time. Another competing aspect, if you want to put it that way, is the Madden-Julian oscillation. We're going into a fairly robust phase 7 and phase 8. These are cold phases, by the way, representative of a negative Arctic oscillation, negative North Atlantic oscillation, and we've got competing factors with that as well. Now, while the GFS ensemble is not wanting the North Atlantic oscillation to go negative, as can be seen here, it's remaining kind of flatline neutral. But if you look at the teleconnections of the models here, this is the ECNWF ensemble. It has a fairly negative North Atlantic oscillation at between -2, even dropping towards -3 sigma below the neutral line here. So there is a lot of complexity to this overall situation here. And the question mark is, as we move into the second half of February, towards the latter half of February and into early March, with the Madden-Julian oscillation rotating into phases 7 and phases 8, which are conducive for cold weather, do we see the right response for the European side of the hemisphere? This is going to be the big question. But you can see within the lower portions of the atmosphere, upper levels of the troposphere, you can see the blocking becoming like essentially peaking around about the 15th of the month. And if you look at the GFS upper level heights here, if we go back to the GFS ensemble actually, and look at the 500 millibar anomalies here, you can see the pressure quite strong, to say the least, here over the Arctic region. So essentially what's happening is we've got this buildup of pressure initially to the north of the UK and Ireland, but as we start to see a shift taking place over the North American side of the Atlantic, that is helping pull this high over towards Greenland, forcing the jet stream and the storm track to get shivved further south. So what we need to take into consideration here is the southward displaced jet. Yes, some folks are looking at the models and saying that the Atlantic is just going to come back and we're going to be back into the mild pattern, and that is a very real possibility, by the way. As the cold air descends south on the European side, it never truly reaches the UK and Ireland here, because what we're seeing is the resistance, the response to the strengthening jet stream over the Atlantic, moving towards the UK and Ireland, essentially shutting the door to that secondary lobe of tropospheric polar vortex into western areas of Europe. It's essentially what's going on over the Atlantic and over the North American side of the pole could actually stop anything coming in from the east. Does that make sense? I hope it does. But this is the GFS ensemble. Very negative in terms of the Arctic oscillation. You've got a strong positive over Greenland. How much south displacement of that storm track do we see? That is going to be another question, because the UK could remain on the colder side of the jet, have areas of low pressure moving in towards the UK and Ireland, getting forced further south, keeping the UK on the colder side as opposed to the milder side. If we've got areas of low pressure that want to lift a little bit further north before reaching the UK and Ireland, that is going to allow milder air to come in from the southwest, force the storm track further south, areas of low pressure further south. You then keep the cold air over the UK and Ireland. This is the thing that we do not know at this moment in time. We do not know the outcome towards the middle portions of this month, whether we're going to allow that Arctic door to then get opened for the UK and Ireland, areas of low pressure getting driven further south of the UK, or is that cold pool a little less strong and the Atlantic a little bit stronger? Therefore, the outcome is very, very different indeed. So let's have a quick look at the view over Europe here in terms of the 500 millibar anomalies here. So this is quite an interesting one to look at. And this kind of reinforces the fact that this is a very complex situation here. So the high pressure itself, the core, now starting to shift towards Greenland and towards Iceland. And that is due to the cold air getting driven into eastern North America. It's pulling this high out of Scandinavia, westwards towards Greenland. And therefore, we're starting to see a more extension of the trough out of North America and into the Atlantic here. And this is where things become more complicated. We've got this kind of cut-off vortex here in the upper levels of the atmosphere. Notice it's essentially surrounded by high pressure to the west over North America, to the north over Greenland, and to the east over the UK and Ireland here. All the while, we've got Arctic air starting to descend southwards in the central areas of Europe. But you notice we're starting to see, with these lobes of Arctic air and storm systems crossing North America, we've got these bowling balls of low pressure, cold pools in the upper levels of the atmosphere beginning to exit east of North America. But look at this here. We've got this strong block over Greenland. We've got this extension eastwards of the trough and the jet. We've got this cold pool over Europe. And the UK sits almost right in the battle zone of these competing air masses. Continue to play through. You can see here that another surge of deep low pressure trough exits North America, crosses over the Atlantic. But again, this situation here could be one of two or three different things. Have that center of low pressure a little bit further south, we're more in the cold air. Have that system a little bit further to the northwest of the UK and Ireland, we're in the milder air. And again, it depends on how strong this high is up over Greenland, over the Arctic region. Can it force these lows further south? It all depends on what competing factor is stronger than the other. And that is worth paying very close attention to. It's a complex situation for sure. So let's have a look at the GFS model, and then we'll look at the ECMWF in terms of the overview chart here. And you can see in the near term, the resistance of that high still centered at the 1038 to 1042 millibars to the north and east of the UK. We've still got this little southeasterly flow, a very tame easterly flow at that. The reason why I say that is we've got temperatures on the face of it at the plus 4, 5 and 6 Celsius. Factor in the breeze, you're closer to freezing. But if this was a real deal easterly, we would have temperatures at or slightly below the freezing mark, with the coldest air to the east, and that flow coming in from a cold continent. We've simply not seen that this time around. But playing through the ECM or the GFS, sorry, you can see here that the flow is coming in from the northeast. We've got the Atlantic trying to move in from the west. Frontal systems bump up against the high. Essentially, they just fall apart because of the high pressure itself. Continuing to play through, we've got another feature running in. It looks as if the GFS has that moisture penetrating a little bit further in over the UK. But again, you've still got this resistance. Look at the high regrouping over southern Norway. So that's essentially acting as a blocker and keeping the UK generally on the colder side of things. Play through the loop eventually towards Wednesday the 19th. So this is quite a far bit out. This is a week tomorrow. You can see here that the Atlantic becomes a little bit more influential according to the GFS run here. And eventually it looks as if the GFS sees the battle won. In terms of the 850s here, this is how it's looking then. So we'll play through the loop. Looks as if the UK right on that dividing line between something particularly cold over Scandinavia and Central Europe and something much milder over the Atlantic here. Continue to play through the UK in that battle zone, but eventually what happens is it looks as if the Atlantic wins out, but it isn't overly clear-cut either, because we may not necessarily have particularly mild air, because obviously that jet is transporting particularly cold air off North America across the Atlantic. It moderates as it crosses the Atlantic, but it may, like we've seen back in January, that westerly flow can still remain fairly cold if you've got a cold North America. Looking at the ECMWF model, go to the overview chart here, and you can see as we play through the overview, we've got this resistance, the high stopping, acting as a barrier from these areas of low pressure moving in, frontal systems moving in off the Atlantic. So it's pretty clear cut through at least the remainder of this week. Beginning of next week, the high wins the battle with low pressure over the Atlantic moving in. And you can see that the ECMWF is starting to show a bit of a split developing here. Areas of low pressure remaining blocked from the UK and Ireland, but we're also seeing undercutting systems moving into the Western Mediterranean basin here, all the while the UK remains fairly cold. If you look at the 850s here, we're on that battleground. I suppose you could argue that we're on the slightly milder side of things here. Play through the 850 temperature profile of the ECMWF. Again, look at the cold air trying to descend south, milder air trying to move in off the Atlantic here. What wins the battle? It's really 50-50 at the moment here, but the ECMWF, according to this latest run, by the time we reach Wednesday, Thursday, 19th, 20th of February, looks as if the Atlantic starts to win this battle overall. But that cold air is never far away from the northern half of the UK. So it is a complex situation that we are continuing to monitor here on Marfogan Weather on YouTube. Looking at the jet stream then, again, like I was saying, as you start to increase the cold, we've got these areas of high pressure at 1055 millibars over the Arctic region. There's that strong block and high pressure forcing the jet within the entire northern hemisphere further south, and therefore we're seeing the colder air getting drained southwards. Once you start to push the jet further south, you're allowing the colder air out of the Arctic into the middle altitude pattern, but then there becomes more complexity to the pattern. The jet becomes more buckled in areas. We've got lobes of mild moving north. We've got lobes of cold diving south. As that cold dives south over North America, we're increasing the strength of the jet stream over the North American side of the pole. We've got cross-polar flow going on here as well. Then as we continue to play through, you notice here that the jet across the entire Eurasian continent, even the North Pacific, it's much further south than normal because of the block across the top. Continue to play through. We've got this deep trough into eastern North America, forcing the jet further north over the Atlantic here. We've got all sorts of splits going on within the eastern North Atlantic with high pressure in control over the UK and Ireland. But it's as we continue to go through the period here, this is moving into the early to mid next week, we're starting to see that jet become more extended further eastwards here. The question mark is going to be how much cold air is over the continent, over the towards the UK and Ireland. Can this cold air force the jet further south, or does it become more influential, essentially wiping out the cold over the UK and Ireland? We're back in mild southwesterly flow. That is going to be what is going to be worth paying close attention to here. So we're going to continue to watch this going forward. Keep it right here in the channel, like and subscribe, and I'll see you tomorrow with more. Bye for now.